Linda, let's get started by just introduce yourself and tell us what you love to make.
Well, I'm Linda Kemshall, and I've been making quilts since my first one was 1974, so that dates me, doesn't it? And then it was very traditional at that time. I made a log cabin quilt, which, well, we cannibalise quilts because Laura and I make so many, and when they've served their purpose, maybe they've been to an exhibition or they've been used for a teaching aid, they very often get chopped up and made into something else. So my first quilt, it still exists, but it's been chopped into very small pieces and embroidered over and painted over and even dyed over some of them. So it's still there, but not as you would recognise it.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive into some of the wonderful ways that you used thread. So let's start off by talking about the type of things you love to create.
Well, I combine a lot of my passions. You know, I'm quite obsessed with keeping a sketchbook and doing painting and drawing, and that's reflected in the quilts that I make. So, I mean, I've got a great big quilt here on the table, too large for you to see on that little camera, I would think. But this is a page from a painting of mine in a sketchbook that has been digitally printed. So it's whole cloth, but it reflects very much my sense of drawing and painting. I won't go into the details of how I've achieved this because it's quite technical, but you can see some of the elements are quilted and then there's paint applied. So I'm kind of bringing those two things together, my love of painting and drawing and my love of quilting. And I do a lot of dense stitching. You can see there's a lot of quilting on this to create texture in the background, but that's quite low-key thread colour choice, because I'm just wanting to texture that background and not have the stitch compete with the image that, you know, I've created from a painting. So it is a contrasting colour of thread, but it's quite subtle. And I've done free motion quilting. That's nearly always I do free motion quilting. And I've tried to create these sort of pathways through. So the quilting can contribute so much to your quilt. And it's true that it's not a quilt till it's quilted, you know, to quote that well-known book.
Yeah.
So it's a layering process. So I'm focusing on the image, but then I'm thinking, what will the thread contribute to this? So sometimes it's very graphic, and I've done that kind of stem with leaf shapes on, free motion quilted. Sometimes it's just to texturize the background, because you need to distribute your stitch so that it's fairly even throughout, because we don't want a wobbly quilt, we want something that is controlled.
Yeah.
So that's most of my quilts, you know, they feature, as I say, a lot of stitch, and you can see how I do that on my website.
Yeah, so let's take a look at a few more.
Okay, I've got a husband who's a musician. He's a guitarist. He's very fond of his guitars. He's got, well, I won't say how many. In fact, he doesn't tell me how many. But this little quilt is called Cherry Red, and it features the sound hole and the strings. And I've got some commercial fabrics in here, which is quite unusual. Mostly I use hand-dyed fabrics. But I think what's interesting about this one, I've almost exclusively used a red thread. But of course I've got lots of different colours in the piecing of this quilt. So the red is very evident on the border here, but kind of disappears into the checkerboard.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that that reflects how you make your colour choices. So you're thinking about the quality of your thread, is it shiny, is it matte, but you're also thinking about how that colour is going to work on the fabrics, and whether you want it to be prominent, as in a drawn line, or whether you want it to just purely create a textured surface.
Yeah, and you have a piece in progress here that we've been seeing on your newsletter.
This is very, very new. So much that
wow.
There's so little quilting on it yet, but I thought you might be interested to see how these things, how the stitch transforms a quilted surface, a quilt surface rather.
Yeah.
This, I'm using here a vintage Irish linen bedsheet, which is quite heavy, quite coarse, and I've fabric painted the whole of the design here, and it's it's showing my love of things in the garden, the natural world. So I've got birds on here, lots of birds, and the sunflowers that have been spectacular this year. We haven't had much sun, but we've had plenty of rain, and they seem to have benefited from that. But I wanted to show how the sunflower evolves and changes. So I've got them in full bloom, and I've got the dead ones as well, and I've got a really dead and crusty looking one down here at the bottom. But when I talk about whether you choose a contrasting colour of thread or whether you blend, again, I don't want to detract from the painting here. So you can see the effect of light and shade. I'm using this kind of curvy motif, which is something I use all the time.
Yeah.
Makes me think of clouds and sky and feathers and flight. I'm working with a cream thread on a cream background because I don't want the line to be too obvious, because with the scale of the painting I want this to kind of just blend and create that interesting movement. It's quite a dynamic line to create with those curvy shapes, but I've got these little images here and I don't want them to be overwhelmed with the stitch. Yeah. So that's why I'm working, you know, in very safe colours with that particular piece.
Okay, and you love handwork as well. So what has been one of your most favourite Madeira threads that you've been using a lot lately for handwork?
Well, I do a combination of, there's usually a lot of free motion machine quilting goes in first, and the handwork tends to come afterwards, more as an embellishment. So I'm using Sensa Green thread for most of the quilting. That's a Sensa Green thread on that sunflower quilt. But sometimes I use the Madeira Lana, and I like the effect of Lana, particularly when I'm working on a woolen surface or a felted. So these little hanging bags are needle felted fibres, woolen fibres onto a piece of felt, and even the spiral shapes there are just fibres laid down, and I've couched those. So they've had a certain amount of needle punching on a little embellisher machine, but then once they're secure and in place, I want to draw attention to them. So I'm using these Lana threads in quite contrasting colours. I think that's the turquoise there, and then I've got the deeper blue on that one. But I love the way that breaks into that shape and creates an interesting line from, it would just be a spiral without the stitch. So again, instead of like the sunflower quilt, I'm not wanting to draw attention to the colour. With this one, it's exactly what I want to do. So that's Lana. It's 50% wool, 50% acrylic. So it blends really nicely with a woolen fabric, a woolen surface. And I've used it to create the stitched edge and the little hanging loop.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the other work that you've done by hand.
Okay, this is a little one you might have spotted on our YouTube channel. I made several of these. Again, that's needle felted. I've just got a little square of black felt there. I've laid the fibres down and punched them in place. And then I've done a certain amount of stitch using Madeira rayon. So where I want lustre and gleam and the light reflective qualities, I go for a shiny thread. And then I've used the Lana again to suggest those little poppies in the foreground.
Beautiful. And you have a work in progress over here?
Oh, there's another example here of using the Lana. This is just purely an embroidery. It's just through a single layer of fabric. The fabric's been coloured with pencils. They're the Derwent Inktense pencils that once it's wetted and allowed to dry, they're permanent on cloth. So I've just suggested the bowl, and then the fruits. That's a certain amount of painting, but mostly relying on the Lana stitch, a long and short stitch. I think it's really vibrant, don't you?
Absolutely beautiful.
I must get round to mounting that or framing that, because I think it would look quite nice if it was actually tidied up and lost all those raggedy edges.
Yeah, and it actually looks finished, actually. It just needs to be mounted, right?
I think it's quite an interesting to have, you know, those heavily stitched, detailed fruits with the sketchy quality of the bowl that they're sitting in. So
beautiful.
you know, you might think it is unfinished, but that's the contrast that I'm wanting to achieve.
Yeah. Do you remember kind of the beginnings of making work with Madeira thread?
Oh, we're going back quite a way. In the early 90s, I think that, I mean, I went to college, to art college, another century, a long, long time ago. Didn't do any textiles there. But I'm from a home where my mother, my grandmother, always made things. So whether it was dressmaking, knitting, crochet. So I come from that kind of a background, and I think when you have that support, there are materials around you that you can dip into and use, and there's that knowledge and experience that you can benefit from. So I'm not quite sure when I first started quilting. I say my first quilt was 1974, but I dabbled in bits before that. And I got involved with the Quilters Guild of Great Britain, which was a long, very informative educational journey for me. I ended up being the stitch advisor, the national advisor for stitch textiles. So, you know, it's been a huge part of my life. Now, Madeira threads, I used to send for them mail order back in the early 90s. So I've always been around them. I'm not quite sure how long I've been a brand ambassador, but it's a good few years now. And I use them exclusively, but you can see I don't just use one type of thread. What I'm doing is thinking what the thread contributes to the work that I'm making and just choosing the most appropriate one. So I use most of Madeira threads now for all sorts of different purposes.
Yeah, and it's so wonderful to have the sustainable thread now,
Yes.
the Sensa Green, and then you can use rayons or polyneons for some sheen, and the beautiful lanas for that heavy texture.
Yes, there's something for every possible use, really.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that the Sensa Green is more ecologically friendly, but I mainly use it because my machines love it and I love the effect that it gives, and it seems to, you know, be perfect for my quilting use.
Yeah. So you and your daughter Laura teach so many different techniques. You have this wonderful vault of courses online available for people to take. So if there was one bit of advice you love to give to students in your classes or workshops, what would it be?
It would, I know it sounds conventional, but it's just try it, because we've been teaching online since 2001. That's quite a long time. Yeah. And people write to us and they say, well, what would happen if you did? And we said, well, have a go, just see. It may not work, do a small piece. You know, it's not the end of the world if you try something and it doesn't actually succeed. You learn as much from a failure as you do from a great success.
Yes.
So we would say, just do it.
Yeah. And what if it turns out better than you ever imagined?
Well, then nobody would be more happy than I would.
Yeah.
I was always told that the best teachers produce the students with the best work, and if the students with the best work sort of, you know, are better than the teacher, it just shows how good a teacher you are.
Absolutely. That is so great. Okay, so let's talk thread for a moment. If there was just one thread tip that you could give to your students, what would it be?
I would say you have to choose what's appropriate to the end result. So you have to, in your mind, imagine the effect that you want, what are you trying to achieve, and then choose the best thread that will give you that effect. So, you know, if you want something detailed, like embroidered like this, you need a thick thread. If you want something very subtle and refined, you know, you want to go for a much finer thread. So it depends there's no one thread. It just depends what you're aiming for.
Absolutely. Okay, so along this wonderful journey that you've had being a creative in the world, what are you really proud of?
I'm proud that people tell me and Laura that we're inspirational, that we unlock creativity, that we reveal to people that they can do things that somehow they've been told in the past they can't or they shouldn't even attempt. So I suppose that's the teacher in me coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many wonderful moments in your courses, and I'll just mention a little moment that I had right now because I took Laura's sketchbook class. And she's so, you know, it's so achievable by everyone, because she mentions, you know, take all those white pages and get them messed up right from the start.
They can be very daunting, can't
Yeah,
they? A
they're not so
pristine, perfect
daunting.
sketchbook is
Yeah.
daunting.
It's little bits like that that really ease the student in. I love that.
That was one of our most successful courses, and still remains to be, because lots of people, they can't imagine that they could work in a sketchbook. They've no experience of that. But everything that you do on a bit of paper that nobody ever has to see, it's just for you and that sketchbook, it'll give you ideas. You can't fail but get ideas, and then you can interpret it in what you might think is your proper work.
Yeah, and you don't always have to dive into your full quilt you're working on. You can always try something on a sample first, right?
Oh, of course. We would always say that. Don't do anything too experimental on a huge quilt. You know, try a little bit first of all.
Okay, so tell us what's coming up soon for you.
Well, we're working towards 2 exhibitions early next year, and that's keeping us very busy. We have to have entirely new work for one exhibition at Leamington Spa, but fortunately the other exhibition is retrospective, so I have got a lot of quilts. When you've been making quilts since 1974, there is no shortage of quilts, despite the fact, you know, we do sell them when we can, but I've got a heap of quilts, so they'll be good to look forward to. And some of them will be getting an airing that no one has seen for a long time.
Yeah. So I know people watching right now are going to want to know where they can find you. So what's your website?
lindakemshall.com.
And what kind of things will we find there?
There's a portfolio, there's a link to our weekly newsletter, and there are also links to all the classes that we have online at various websites, and our contact details at Instagram and so on.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story today.
Our pleasure.